and the church is going to attack those gates. And the church is going to win out as it attacks. It's the wrong idea to sing the song, "Hold the fort, for I am coming." We're not supposed to be in the fort. We're supposed to be out of the fort and on the field and attacking the enemy. And if we do this, we're promised victory. The gates of hell, the very gates of Hades, cannot hold out against an obedient church. Now, in saying to Peter that you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, there have been three basic interpretations given to this. The first is that Peter himself is the rock. The second one is that the confession of Peter is the rock. And the third is that Jesus is the rock, and the confession of him as the Messiah is the rock on which the church is going to be built. So it can be the person Peter, it can be his confession of Christ, or it can be the truth behind that confession, Christ himself, which can be the rock at this point. And without, in this particular time, taking a long discussion of this, I just want you to understand that the interpretation that the Catholic Church has made is that this rock is Peter. The interpretation of the Protestant churches is that it's either Peter's confession or the truth behind the confession that Jesus himself is that rock. Now he then gave instructions to the disciples, just as he had previously given instructions to the healed blind man, do not go back into the village and tell everybody. And he said, don't tell anybody now that I am the Christ. That time will come later. But the present time, do not tell anybody that I am the Christ. Now this great confession on the part of Peter, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God," is the actual basis of the Christian faith, which makes each man who follows Peter's example a Christian himself, personally, by his own confession. We're going to turn now to the following teaching. Jesus has just accepted the interpretation that he's the Messiah. Now, the problem here is that when he's the Messiah, the disciples shared the common Jewish point of view that the Messiah was going to provide for political victory over their enemies. And Jesus is going to have to correct their idea. And while it is true that we who believe the Bible expect Jesus yet to reign in this world, that at his first coming he came principally to die for our sins, it's at his future second coming that he is going to rule. And these disciples expect him to rule immediately. And Jesus finds it necessary to explain to them that long before his rule is going to come, there must first come his suffering. And this is what explains to us as we continue now in verse 21 through verse 28, as Malcolm Brubaker reads for us.
From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him and began to rebuke him, saying, God forbid, Lord, this shall never happen to you. But he turned and said to Peter, Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you are not on the side of God, but of men. Then Jesus told his disciples, If any man would come after me, let him deny himself, and take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his life? Or what shall a man give in return for his life?
Now this again is a very important passage at which we're looking. Jesus begins to explain his coming death as soon as they have recognized him as the Messiah. We sometimes have a common saying, Jesus is the answer. I would like to modify that to say Jesus is the answer if you're asking the right question. Jesus is not the answer to every question. He is the answer to the right question. If you want to know the truth, Jesus is the answer. If you want to know whether you should rob the bank on Thursday night or wait till Friday, he's not the answer for that one. There are some things Jesus doesn't answer. They're not his area. Now, he tells these folks that now if they believe that he's the Messiah is going to reign, but he's going to die first. And that he must go to Jerusalem, and he must suffer from the elders of the community, and from the priests, and from their writers. And that he must suffer death. And that on the third day he must come back to life again. And Peter, the very one now who has been called a rock, proves now to be a hindrance, and the one that Jesus calls a rock now calls him Satan. He said, "Get thee behind me, Satan." So this rock is also Satan. Don't misunderstand me. He means that he's speaking the advice that Satan would give him, because Satan would not want Jesus to die for the sins of the world. He says to this so-called rock, he said, "You are a hindrance to me. You're not on the side of God," that is, not in general, but in this particular instance, because when you're counseling me not to die, you're on the side of men, and you're thinking as a man and not as God thinks. And then he makes the general principle. If any man wants to be a follower of Jesus, he is to deny himself and take up his cross. There have been a lot of foolish things said about this. People have talked about an illness as a cross. They've talked about an ill wife or husband as a cross. They've talked about unsaved children as being a cross. They've talked about lack of money as a cross. Now, these may be terrific disadvantages and terrific problems, but there's really only one cross, and that is the denial of self. There are many prayers in the Bible and many prayers in the world, but they really, if they're genuine, can all be added up in one prayer. There's only one real prayer, and that's the prayer that Jesus prayed in Gethsemane. We'll talk about that later, when he said, "Not my will." That's what we mean here. We're talking here now about denying oneself. Not my will, but thine be done. Every other prayer can be summed up into that. When we get to the point that we understand this, and we've submitted ourselves to God, then we have it made. He said, if any man wants to save his life and try to protect himself, he's going to lose it. If any man gives his life for God, he shall find his life. And then he said, what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and owns stocks, real estate, bonds, mortgages? Hey, he's got money in the banks in Switzerland. He's hedged against every contingency. What good is that going to do him when he dies? The old statement is there are no pockets in a shroud, which is what we used in one time, the sheet they wrapped the body in after death. There are no pockets in a shroud. There's nothing you can take with you. Even back in the Old Testament they knew, naked came I into the world and naked shall I go from here. And we are totally stripped. Someone asked after the death of one of the richest Americans, how much did he leave? The answer was, whatever man does, he left it all. He left it all. He left everything. That's true of all of us. Naked came we into the world, and naked shall we depart from it. What would a man give in exchange for his life? And then we have Mark adding, for whosoever is ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father and with the holy angels.